Today's reading is Romans chapter 15, verses 17 through 29. Therefore, I glory in Christ Jesus in my service to God. I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me in leading the Gentiles to obey God by what I have said and done, by the power of signs and miracles through the power of the Spirit. So from Jerusalem all the way around to Elysium, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. It has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. Rather, as it is written, those who were not told about him will see, and those who have not heard will understand. This is why I have been hindered from coming to you. But now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, and since I have been longing for many years to see you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to visit you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there, after I have enjoyed your company for a while. Now, however, I am on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the saints there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. They were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have shared in the Jews' spiritual blessings, they owe it to the Jews to share with them their material blessings. So after I've completed this task and have made sure that they have received this fruit, I will go to Spain and visit you on the way. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the full measure of the blessing of Christ. Well, what stands out to me in this passage was this idea that Paul clearly understood his calling, and that calling orchestrated his steps. To say again, Paul clearly understood his calling, and that calling orchestrated his steps. I don't know about you, but there's so often where I can be confused about my identity or calling in Jesus. Or I can be confused about direction in life, or, am I on the right path, or should I go this way or this way? And the result of either of those things, either doubting or being unclear about who I am personally, or doubting or being unclear about where I'm heading, results in a place of being stuck. I don't know if you can relate to that, but are there times where you just feel stuck? And it's maybe, if you're like me, stuck not because there's not opportunity or activity, but of just not clarity about where to head. That's what I feel. Do you ever feel about that? Well, here's what I loved about this passage and that really stood out to me. It's that first, Paul was just very, very clear about his calling. And we've seen that throughout his letters and throughout Romans, but in verse 20, it's put very succinctly here. It's always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. That's why Paul sees himself as the apostle to the Gentiles, to go where folks have never heard the good news. Like, that's his clear calling. And yet, when we look at Paul's life, the central factor is that calling has been sure all throughout. But the way his paths have been directed, including in this passage, wouldn't be at all what he had in mind. So we read through Acts together, and we saw how God's Spirit moved them to go in certain ways and not to go in other ways. And in this passage, verse 22, says, he's been hindered from coming to you. So Paul had a unique calling, and Paul had a desire to come to them, to see them, the Roman believers, but had so far been hindered from doing so. Paul had a desire in this passage to go to Spain. That was even further than Rome, but so far he had been hindered from doing so. So everywhere Paul went, what the constant was, he was secure of his identity and calling. And then he had the opportunity to live that out wherever he was. So when Paul is in chains, he has the ability to live out his calling, to preach the good news to those who don't yet know it. When Paul is sort of waiting for God's movement. I think about Paul when he sees the man from Macedonia. He had wanted to go east. That was his intent. But then he has a vision that God says, go west. So he does that. And so the reality is, wherever Paul goes, whether he's stuck in chains or whether he's waiting for a moment to be directed or whether he's heading according to his plan or whether his plans change dramatically and he goes elsewhere, Paul is able to live out his clear calling of taking the good news of Jesus to people who had never heard. And so even in this passage, verses 23 and following, what he's saying is, those hindrances that have kept me from my longing to come to you, they've been alleviated. My work is done here. And it's time, I believe, Paul's saying, for him to be able to shift his focus and to go to Spain, which was sort of the ends of the known world at that time, at least as far west as it could get. That was his intent. But he was going to be able to, he was planning to be able to come to Rome. And he felt like he'd been able to share so much truth, so much good truth, hard truth. But he's ready to come see them, these people whom he's not really met, but deeply loves. And he says in verse 29, I know that when I come to you, I will come in the full measure of the blessing of Christ. So that's still his intent. But whatever happens, whether he makes it there or not, we do know that Paul never makes it to Spain. We do know that Paul makes it to Rome, but not as a free man under chains. So his plans change even from what he intends here, but he's still able, wherever he is, to live out his calling, to take the good news of Jesus to people who have not yet known. And there's... he's on sort of a trip right now. He's going to go to Jerusalem in 25 through 27 to take a gift to the impoverished Jewish believers in Jerusalem. And so he's got this one more sort of mission to do before he's going to come to them. That's his intent. And we do know that Paul does fulfill that part of the journey by taking that gift to Jerusalem, and it's there that he's caught and sent and tried. But I think for you and for me, the important thing at all times is to continually make sure we have a clear identity and calling in Jesus. And some of that clear identity and calling, it just begins with us being his child, his son or daughter. That we need to be firm in that. And then secondly, to be firm and clear in that calling that God has for us. And as we're doing that, we can, even if we feel stuck from what's behind us or in front of us, we can live out that calling wherever we are. For me, the way I'd articulate that is to shepherd the movement of gospel communities that hand off the faith to the next generation. For me, that's as clear as I can articulate that calling. And the good news is I can do that right where I'm at. I can also do that in my neighborhood. I can do that around the kids' school. I have the privilege of doing a job where my income comes from that. But even aside from the income, I could do that in the workplace, and so can you. So no matter where you are, no matter if you're going, fast-paced, right down exactly where you believe you're supposed to be, or if you feel stuck, the good news is that you can fill your identity and calling exactly where you are. And as that's happening, there are times where God will say, stay, and there are times where God will say, okay, it's time to go. And this is a passage for Paul where he's been inhibited from doing some of the dreams in his heart, but he's almost ready, he believes, to be able to go into some new frontiers. And so may that be an encouragement to you, that you can be clear in your identity and calling, and you can live that out exactly where you are today.